Do you want to pulverize your opponents while stealing and sacrificing their creatures? Well, then this Herigast Erupting Nullkite deck is perfect for you. The new Commander Herigast from Modern Horizons 3 of course comes with good news and bad news. The good news being that there is finally a dragon deck that I want to play. The bad news being that I have to admit I technically own a Eldrazi deck. Eldrazi players, I'm sorry, it's just not my vibe. But Eldrazi or non-Herigast is absolutely the vibe. Today we are breaking down an exciting Herigast deck. One that is built to abuse the ability that gives all of our creatures Emerge. Emerge is an incredibly strong ability that reduces the casting cost by sacrificing a creature. So stealing our opponent's creatures and sacking them to play our chonky boys is fair game. We advance our gameplay by using graveyard tricks, sneak attack effects, token copies, and of course by stealing our opponent's creatures and sacrificing them. This is a value town deck using big beefy babies with wild ETB and die triggers, big dragon energy, and of course some Eldrazi titans. Look, I don't hate them all. So grab your bathing suits, get your work boots ready because things are about to get hot and heavy with Herigast Erupting Nullkite. There is no sponsor on today's video. Instead, I'd like to call out our Patreon. If you enjoy this new channel and want to help support it, consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You get access to voting on video topics, tokens, or even get your name in the credits of the videos. Hey, that's good stuff. So let's start by breaking down Herigast. Herigast Erupting Nullkite is a 6/6 Eldrazi dragon for 9 generic. It itself has Emerge for 6 generic and 2 red. You may cast this spell by sacrificing a creature and paying the Emerge cost reduced by that creature's mana value. Noting that you can only sack one creature to a single Emerge cost and not multiple creatures. When you cast this spell, you may exile your hand. If you do, draw 3 cards. This May ability is awesome because you can choose not to use it if your hand is full of good stuff. Of course, it has flying. And lastly, each creature spell you cast has Emerge. The Emerge cost is equal to its mana cost. Now, this Emerge ability is what we're building this entire deck around. On face value, sacrificing creatures is not ideal. But if our deck is optimized for this, then this can always be used to work in our favor. The goals of this deck are quite simple while still being incredibly strong. Cast Herigast as early as possible. Do this by sacrificing early turn creatures to its Emerge ability. Once Herigast is out, we'll want to keep emerging and casting as many creatures as we can for as little mana as possible, creating a ton of value and building up a strong board presence in the process. Often picking off players with our huge creatures with aggressive keywords like trample, haste, menace, and of course flying. But given we want to maximize how we leverage our 40+ creatures in this deck, let's start there. The mana curve in this deck is a little high, but since we're reducing the cost of our creature spells, this will not be a problem. Early turn ramp creatures are amazing to have in your opening hand. Cards like Pilgrim's Eye, which has an ETB allowing you to search your library for a mountain and putting it into your hand. Scampering Surveyor and Solemn Simulacrum let you search your library for a mountain and put it into the battlefield tap. Another amazing creature is Treasure Keeper, a 3/3 construct for 4 generic. When it dies, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land card with mana value 3 or less. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Put all revealed cards not cast this way on the bottom of your library in a random order. Now, these are all great smaller creatures to sacrifice, but we are fine with sacrificing any of our value creatures because of cards like our boy Felden of the Third Path, a 2/3 human artificer for 1 generic and 2 red. Create a token that's a copy of target creature card in your graveyard, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. It gains haste, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. Now, this card showcases exactly some of the fun graveyard tricks we want to be doing with Herigast. If you've already played and sacrificed a sad robot to emerge Herigast, then copy this card from your graveyard. The token ETB will net you an extra tapped mountain. You can potentially attack somebody with it, but make sure the coast is clear before doing so, because more importantly is that you'll want to sacrifice it to an emerge cost of another creature. Since you would be forced to sacrifice this token copy at your next end step, instead do it during one of your main phases to an emerge cost. A great way to abuse this emerge ability. And that sequence highlights a bit of the decision making we'll be doing in this deck. Keep in mind, since sacrificing a creature to emerge is part of the cost of casting a creature, your opponents can't stop you by killing the creature you're sacrificing in response to you casting the new creature. Now, another way to create tokens of creatures to help as sacrifice fodder is with the creature Jaxus the Troublemaker. Pay 1 red and tap, discard a card, create a token that's a copy of another target creature that you control. It gains haste, and when this creature dies, draw a card. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step, activate only as a sorcery. And a name that I absolutely love, Calamity Galloping Inferno, is a creature that makes 2 copies of whatever rides it. Yeehaw! Whenever it attacks while saddled, choose a non-legendary creature that saddled it this turn and create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of it. Sacrifice that token at the beginning of the next end step, repeat this process once. Then there is Molten Echoes, a 4-drop enchantment for 2 generic and 2 red. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type, most likely being dragons. Whenever a non-token creature of the chosen type enters the battlefield under your control, create a token that's a copy of that creature. That token gains haste, exile it at the beginning of the next end step. Additionally, we have the 4-drop enchantment Flame Shadow Conjuring. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 1 red. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that creature. That token gains haste, exile it at the beginning of the next end step. And like with all of these tokens, you'll want to be sacrificing them during a main phase before this end step trigger happens. Now, getting this card out early can quickly get you miles ahead on your game plan. Getting extra copies of creatures for 1 red mana is just ridiculous value in this deck. For example, if you cast for Yusei the Falling Star and Flame Shadow Conjuring is out on the battlefield, you may want to pay the 1. Pay the 1 red, obviously. But once you choose to sacrifice the token, it will hit the graveyard and you will get another die trigger, then dealing 5 damage to each creature without flying. You can then sacrifice the non-token version to an emerge cost when you see fit. Another good creature to copy with Flame Shadow is Boggart Hellkite. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 5 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets. For 1 extra red mana, you will get 2 ETBs of this. And that is just awesome if an opponent's board presence is challenging yours, or perhaps you want to burn somebody's face. It's also important to note that this card has Flash. This opens up the option to emerge it out in response to a removal spell or detrimental ability that is targeting one of your creatures, effectively blanking whatever was targeting your creature. This is why Flame Shadow Conjuring is such an excellent card and allows us so many fun tricks for so little mana investment. As we now know, the exile at the beginning of the next end step really doesn't come with much of a downside, and this is because we'll just use these token copies as sacrifice fodder when casting a creature with Emerge. Another great bit of sacrifice fodder is Squee the Immortal, a small creature you can cast from your graveyard and exile. Whenever you have some extra mana, you can store it in Squee by casting him and using him to emerge something in the future. This can even net you mana if you have your Burgi God of Storytelling in play. Burgi is an awesome multi-facing card. The creature side allows you to store mana between phases, and the artifact side can help you stay on top of card advantage. Now, getting Anger in your graveyard is always a must, because once it's in your graveyard, all creatures you control gain haste. The fact that we have an easy way to sacrifice Anger to help emerge another creature really makes it that much better in our deck. We also have a handful of reduced cost creatures that act like quasi-ramp when casting with Emerge. A perfect example is the excellent card Oxida Golem, a 3/2 6-drop golem with affinity for mountain. This spell costs 1 generic less to cast for each mountain you control. If you have 6 mountains out, this card is casted for free. You can immediately use this as sacrifice fodder for the emerge cost of something massive like Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, or perhaps even Herigast with Commander Tax. Other great creatures like this are the ones with affinity for artifacts. Frogmite Sojourner's Champion and Frogmere Enforcer are perfect sacrifice fodder if you're reduced casting these with the help of your mana rocks, equipment, artifact creatures, and treasure tokens. Now, Cavern Horde Dragon doesn't technically have affinity for artifacts, but it does have this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest number of artifacts an opponent controls. Plus, it's an awesome way to make a bunch of treasure tokens when it hits an opponent. Now, a prototype creature like Skitterbeam Battalion is an interesting card to highlight. A 4/4 for 9 generic, or a 2/2 for 3 generic and 2 red. It has trample and haste, but more importantly, when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, create 2 tokens that are copies of it. It's important to call out that whatever CMC you cast this creature as will be its CMC when using it for other creatures' emerge ability, and that includes the token copies of it. Emerging into a 9-drop Skitterbeam will allow you to essentially ignore the mana cost on the next 3 creatures you play. Now, given that this is a deck that lives in Value Town, let's talk about all of the strong ETBs that will help you control the board state and respond when needed. needed. Let's first look at some card advantage for when you're needing to refuel the tank. At Sushi, the Blazing Sky is a 4/4 flying trampler for 2 generic and 2 red, and its die trigger is excellent once we sacrifice it. When it dies, choose one. Exile the top 2 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards, or create 3 treasure tokens. There is so much value in either of these options. Find extra cards to play, or a healthy handful of treasure tokens. Now Ox of Aganos has, when it enters the battlefield, discard your hand, then draw 3 cards. Plus, you can pay its escape cost later in the game, turns after it has been sacrificed. Pay 2 red mana, exile 8 other cards from your graveyard. You may cast this card from your graveyard. Now, exiling 8 cards from your graveyard can be steep, given we want to make token copies from cards in our graveyard. But if you need the cards in hand, do not hesitate to use this escape ability. Just make sure not to exile cards that have ETBs that you may rely on to later win the game. Nullspine Dragon is a 7/5 flyer for 5 generic and 2 red. When it enters the battlefield, you may discard your hand and draw cards equal to the damage dealt to target opponent this turn. Now, it is important to cast this during your second main phase after you have attacked. Now, this can result in a massive draw, which can lead to a devastating turn for your opponents, but help you close the game. Now, we are running Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, a beefy titan that you can cast, and it draws you 4 cards. Ruin Grinder has, when it dies, each player may discard their hand and draw 7 cards. This is an awesome wheel effect that can help you replenish your hand, and it also doesn't hurt that it has mountain cycling on it. And speaking of wheel effects, we have Reforge the Soul and Wheel of Misfortune. Both of these are great budget options to the reserve list card Wheel of Fortune. And let us not forget that Herigast itself can allow you to exile your hand and draw 3 cards, and this can be excellent when we replay it. A fun trick with Herigast is that you can sacrifice it and send it back to the command zone, then using a big creature to recast Herigast with Emerge, ideally one that's big enough to get around the command tax, then using the draw ability to refuel your hand. Fun little trick, but I wouldn't suggest this unless you absolutely need the card draw. And something to note is that if you don't have any cards in your hand, it doesn't matter, you can still use this ability to draw 3 cards. Now, what about stealing your opponent's creatures? We have no problem sacrificing our own creatures to emerge another, but it is extra sweet when we can get rid of opponent's pesky creatures by using them to emerge more of our own. Zealous Conscripts is the classic mono red theft card, a 3/3 human warrior for 4 generic and 1 red. It has haste, and when it enters the battlefield, gain control of target permanent until end of turn. Untap that permanent, it gains haste until end of turn. Cast this during your first main phase, steal the biggest and nastiest creature, potentially attack with it, then during your second main phase, sacrifice that creature to emerge one of your own. Your opponents will sure love you when you do this. Psych! The new Modern Horizons 3 creature, Hideous Taskmaster, is a similar but better creature. You get to steal 1 target creature from each opponent, and they gain Trample, Haste, and Annihilator 1. This card is perhaps another go-to for any mono red deck wanting to steal creatures. The CMC is a bit high, but it works perfectly in our deck. And Morton Primordial has, when it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, gain control of up to 1 target creature that player controls until end of turn. Untap those creatures, they gain haste until end of turn. Another awesome creature with a theft ability. Now, what other nasty little tricks do we have hidden up our sleeves? That would be sneak attack effects, aka cheating out creatures for a reduced cost. The God Enchantment creature Perforos Bronze Blooded helps us with this. Pay 2 generic and 1 red, you may put a red creature card or an artifact creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. Perforos also gives all of our creatures haste in case we don't have anger in our yard yet. But even better is the namesake card Sneak Attack, a classic enchantment for 3 generic and 1 red. Pay 1 red, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. That creature gains haste. Sacrifice that creature at the beginning of the next end step. Now, this card is not always an auto-include in red commander decks, given you're only getting to cheat out those creatures to hit your opponents only once. But since we're wanting to sacrifice creatures to emerge anyway, this card is perfection. Paying only 1 red mana to cheat out a 7-drop and then use it as sacrifice fodder to emerge another creature means you're saving yourself 6 generic mana. Plus, you'll likely get a great ETB and can even attack with a creature first before you sacrifice it to an emerge creature. Also, it is important to note that you can do this multiple times per turn and can do it at instant speed, turning your creature's ETBs into a 1 mana instant tied to a potential blocking creature. There are so many upsides to using Sneak Attack. And speaking of removal, let's look at the excellent ways we have to deal with our opponent's board states. Duplicant exiles a target non-token creature when in ETBs. Meteor Golem destroys target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Cityscape Escape Leveler has a cast and attack trigger that allows you to destroy up to one target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a tapped Power Stone token. Also noting that it has Unearth, so you can return it from your graveyard. It will have haste and you will have to sacrifice it at your next end step. However, we'll just use this to emerge another creature. Then we have everybody's favorite thick boy, Themberchild, a 5/5 non-flying dragon with trample, but you can exert a creature when he attacks to give him flying. Now that's flavor. It costs 4 generic and 3 red. When it enters the battlefield, he deals X damage to each other creature without flying, and each player, where X is the number of mountains that you control. This card can be a choice finisher to help you close out a game. Now speaking of winning, how else does this deck win the game? Of course you can win with this deck through its big dragon energy. You will have plenty of options with your beefy flying dragons to smack your opponents in the air with. Now Combustible Gearhulk is bait that your opponents may not take in the late game, but it could put them in a tight spot. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent may have you draw 3 cards. If the player doesn't, you may mill 3 cards, then Combustible Gearhulk deals damage to that player equal to the total mana value of those cards. Ouch. Because of the high CMC of the cards in our deck, the chances of this dealing over 10 plus damage is incredibly high. Then there's also Spawn of Thraxes, which is just incredibly fun. When it enters the battlefield, it deals damage to any target equal to the number of mountains that you control. Since it is not legendary, making several copies of it, blasting one player in the face, then swinging at another with a bunch of hasty flyers is a perfect way to win. And if you're 1v1 in the late game, this can be an immediate game-ending card. This is a strong deck with plenty of options to close out the game. You'll be casting a lot of creature spells, so make sure you find ways to consistently refuel your hand to keep the value train going. As long as you can keep your deck moving forward, you have a great chance of steamrolling your way to victory. Now, who would exactly enjoy playing this deck? Of course, mono-red Stompy players. This deck's game plan is fairly straightforward, but it also leaves a lot of room to get creative with how you use your creature ETBs. If you enjoy getting crafty with stuff like this, then try this deck out. If you're a lover of Kindred Dragons, but also want a fresh new game plan, build this deck ASAP. However, if you're a blue mage who loves Spellslinger decks, then this deck might not be for you. And if you are a dwarf attempting to reclaim the Lonely Mountain to restore honor to your kin, then you probably wouldn't like this deck either. Now you are all ready to go to Dragon Value Town and smash your opponents with some beefy flyers. Make sure to comment which Modern Horizons 3 commanders you would like us to cover next. Thank you so much to my co-writer and lead brewer of this deck, the GOAT of deck brewing, Sasha Jelten. Now fly to your LGS and give this deck a spin.